Hi, everybody.
Hi, everybody. Welcome to our day one of our 9-day tribute to our beloved St. Matthew. You can read about our journey with St. Matthew in the Facebook group, but we are honoring him with the 9 days leading up to our designated feast day for him, which is April 15th, tax day. St. Matthew was a tax collector. But we're going to honor him by talking for 9 days about one of the core principles for Way of the Rose, which is ecology, not theology. And I will never forget the first time Clark said those 3 words to me sitting right here at this table. And he can share with you how he came to them, because they are a powerful tool for unraveling all of the knots of civilization.
Well, I think we've talked before about the fact that, in the 1990s, Perdita and I began to become, concerned about climate change and the 6th extinction, and began to ask ourselves, was there any kind of sane ecological environmental response to these issues, in the scriptures of the world's religions? I searched for years and years, looking for something. And over the course of that journey, I came up with a very simple rubric in order to discern whether a teaching, a spiritual teaching was valid. Because you get a book like the Bible or the Buddhist sutras or the Quran or whatever, and, it's really a kind of a grab bag, They'd all be flagged for hate speech today, right? Because they have hateful things in them, they have misogynist things in them, they have a lot of bad things in them, but they also have good things. So what I did was I came up with this very, very simple test. Does it say something valuable about the ecology? Is it an ecologically based teaching, or is it not? Because if it's not, then it isn't grounded in anything real. It's just grounded in human civilization, the desire for domination or conquest.
I think Claude Lévi-Strauss, the famous anthropologist, once said that there were 2 kinds of culture. There was oral culture, and oral culture was primarily about the natural world, because it was designed to help you manage your relationships with the natural world. And then there was textual, written culture, and written culture was primarily the story of human beings and their age of conquest. And it was, in fact, surprisingly, in the Bible, there are almost no animals. Even the animals of the Nativity are not actually mentioned in Scripture. That's an oral tradition, which is very important to note. So when we're looking for the ecological teachings in these written texts, we are looking for the oral sediment that's been left in them. One of the things, it's always important to state up front that Yeshua, the Second Temple period teacher, would probably, coming from Nazareth, not have been literate. He didn't read and write, and the people he was teaching probably didn't read and write. And that means that what he was offering was oral teaching embedded in the ecology of where he lived. Many decades after his death, those teachings get written down by authors, actually not in the language Jesus spoke, which was Aramaic, but the language of conquest, which was Greek. So there's always going to be this disconnect between the scripture and the actual teaching. Clark and I, when we began memorizing the Gospel of St. Matthew, we pick and choose.
Yeah,
and
we didn't memorize the whole thing.
No way.
The greatest hits.
So what we look at is ecology, not theology. Is the teaching that's being offered to us corroborated by what we experience in the natural world?
Mm-hmm. And it's important to realize that, Jesus was a country boy. In fact, he doesn't fare well in the city. Whenever he goes to a city, it doesn't go well for him. He is a country boy. His points of reference are the natural world. He was familiar with farming techniques. He was familiar with plants and animals. His teachings are all based, either in ecology directly or in the ecological lives of his countrymen.
And what we want to look at is the ecology of those teachings. So much theological conversation is based on abstraction. I sometimes talk about the difference between concrete language, trees, dirt, moon, mountains, seeds, flowers, versus theological dogmatic language, enlightenment,
Right.
1,000 different purity terms for describing abstract states that are completely disconnected from the lived reality of real bodies on a real planet.
Right.
And so what Clark and I are interested in is how do we reintegrate ourselves spiritually back into the life of this earth.
Yeah.
So one of the first verses after the Beatitudes that we memorized is one that's very familiar to us. In the beginning, it was very easy to memorize these because they're so familiar. And we'll share it today. We're going to do it all orally. And there's been something about memorizing these. We recite them every morning. When you memorize words, they become different inside of you. And
Yeah, they live inside of you in a different way. The text doesn't become, the authoritative point of reference, right? It's not like you go to a book for your understanding. You take the words within you and you live with them, and you experience their lived wisdom and their lived reality.
I sometimes imagine having grandchildren and sharing these teachings with them, but orally, that they came from a person and not a book, and my lived experience of them. So we'll share the first one. And we'll talk about it at great length today. And the first is one you're all probably familiar with. Consider the lilies of the field, how they grow. They toil not, neither do they spin. And yet I say unto you that even Solomon in all his glory was not arrayed like one of these. Therefore ask not, what shall we eat? What shall we drink? What shall we wear withal? Take no thought of the morrow, for the morrow shall take thought of the things of itself. Sufficient unto the day is the evil thereof. This may be the most radically, ecologically sane statement ever delivered to human beings.
Yeah, it's the Buddha holding up a flower, right? It's that primary, fundamental ecological teaching. What are we? How shall we live? This, right? Just this.
And the lilies of the field are not incidental to me. In July, daylilies cover where we live. They're everywhere. How long does a daylily last? A day. But there are more daylilies, and there's a season of daylilies, and then there's a season of another flower. And what does it mean to live like a flower? And Jesus, we can get very heady and abstract and theological about this, but look at what Jesus says. Consider the lilies of the field, how they grow. They toil not, neither do they spin. Now, Clark and I had a long discussion this morning about spinning. And so we want to look at spinning and toil. Toil is the experience of an agricultural peoples, of civilized peoples. Our hunter-gatherer ancestors did not experience life as work and rest. The Sabbath is the invention of people who have an experience of work. And we'll get to what Jesus has to say about the Sabbath later. But toil, the toil of trying to create a living for yourself, but Jesus identifies that toil with spinning. And we need to look at spinning not in the kind of pleasurable activity that a lot of women say experience with crochet or knitting, or even that we see with the lady and her threads of fate and weaving, but the toil of spinning for civilization.
Yeah.
And if we actually look at the history of slavery, we see its relationship to the production of an excess of cloth. Right. You see slavery in the earliest days, this kind of having to create vast amounts of excess material.
Right. The women were tied to the home, literally, by spinning, and the need to produce cloth for
hours and hours and
larger
hours.
families. Right.
Larger. This wasn't just making a beautiful something for someone. This was endless work that you was just going to make your eyesight go and your hands go. And then we look at slavery in the American South. It's tied to spinning, cotton. We look at slavery today, and it's tied to the factories in Asia, tied to our cheap clothing.
Cheap clothing, that's right, for the big box stores.
So this is a radical statement. It's a radical vision of what we've gotten wrong. And 2,000 years ago, Jesus is trying to correct it. Stop spinning. Stop. And in fact, his own teacher, John the Baptist, Yochanan, he wears animal skins and comes out of the wilderness having lived on honey and locusts.
Yeah, nearly all of Jesus's teachings are harkening back to an earlier way of life, right? He's coming into, he's traveling from town to town and coming into these cities, and he's basically telling people that there is a way of living, right, that does not rely on a monetary economy. He's constantly overturning the idea of a monetary economy, right? He's constantly saying things like, yes, those who work for, 1 hour get the same as the people who work for 12 hours, right? He's constantly undercutting this idea that you get what you pay for. He says the earth is filled with blessings, and if we are generous to one another, right, and practice simplicity, there's always enough to go around.
So, 2,000 years ago, civilization was really on the move, right? We have the Roman Empire has come in and colonized Jesus' homeland. But civilization has been around for thousands and thousands of years before that. And so it's really clear that it's a catastrophe to Jesus. This is a catastrophe. This sedentary way of living, where we are always putting aside storehouses. We want more, more, more. Let there be more money, more clothes, more food.
More people.
And that creates more people, and it creates more slavery and more war and more misogyny, which is embedded in this text. And what Jesus is saying is stop. Go leave the cities, go live on the land, figure out what there is to eat, stop worrying about what, all your clothes. Now, one of the things that's really interesting about our hunter-gatherer ancestors is how rich their lives were. Let's take a look at the Magdalenian period, which is a 20,000-year period that precedes the advent of agriculture. And these people were hunters and gatherers. They did not farm. They did not have cities. They did not have hierarchical culture, but they had culture. Extraordinary culture.
Yeah, the joys of culture without the burdens of civilization. These were people who, traveled in fairly small bands, moving across the land, staying for a place for a period of time, following the migrations of the herds and the flowering of the different sorts of plants from one season to the next, but always experiencing enough. And I believe we talked in The Way of the Rose about the fact that there was no lost Eden for these people, because Eden was never a single place, right? Eden was the next place you moved on to. You're always moving on to Eden.
And that lightness of moving across the land allowed the land to recover behind you from your presence. So you were never creating pollution and deprivation. What happens when you do agriculture is you deplete the fields, then you need to go to war to get more land, to kill more fields, and fertilize them with blood and other animals.
Some of you may have read a wonderful novel. It's called A Novel of Ideas by Daniel Quinn, called Ishmael, which is about a talking gorilla who takes a student, right, a human student. And its object is to go back through history and to explain to this human student where human beings sort of got off the long, green evolutionary path, right, of their long story, a sustainable path through deep time. That where did you get off that path? Where did you end up on a road, leading to a cliff, which is where we find ourselves today? And he boils it down to a very simple idea. He said that there were once groups of human beings who were leavers and once groups who were takers. And the leavers were both leaving what they couldn't use and leaving it behind and moving on to the next place, right? They were constantly leaving behind what they couldn't use or whatever. They didn't accumulate surpluses of any kind. The takers were the people who took and took and took from the natural environment and ultimately settled in one place to harness all of the resources of that area until they became depleted.
Take no thought of the morrow.
Yeah.
Take no thought of the morrow.
Yeah, don't take thought of the morrow. Don't make your primary concern your own survival. I mean, that's the great paradox of this. Jesus teaches a way of life where you are not constantly concerned with your own survival and terrified that you might not have enough, right?
And the interesting thing about the hunter-gatherer lifestyles in the Magdalenian era was life was not nasty, brutish, and short. That's an outgrowth of civilization. Yeah. In fact, all evidence suggests that people worked a couple hours a day and spent the rest of their time making art and loving each other. And they took care of their old and their handicapped. They had musical instruments that were very sophisticated. They had art that may be some of the most sophisticated art we've ever had. We're still trying to get back to art that's that extraordinary. Mm-hmm. They had storytelling. They even
music, dance, everything.
And let me talk about their clothing, because we talked about the no spinning. They did beadwork on their clothing, and they did create weaving and do things to make their clothing beautiful. There's every sense that they had a celebration of art and beauty.
Right. And even weaving and spinning, when it begins, is for personal use, right? It's not a burden, right?
It's a joy.
It's a ritual. Right.
It's a joy and a ritual. It's not going to become the need to create vestments and robes and outfits that show your power. A lot of what happens with clothing and civilization is what's called, what's the thing Daniel Lord Smell talks about the brain, how you know what I'm talking about.
Psychotropic mechanisms.
There we go. That's why I'm married to him. Explain a psychotropic mechanism.
Okay, there's a wonderful book called On Deep History in the Brain by a man with the unlikely name of Daniel Lord Smale. He's not a lord, that's just his middle name. It's not Snail, it's Smale, S-M-A-I-L. And his father was one of the pioneers of the academic field of deep history. And Smale took up that cause in a book where he examines the history of the human brain and how it evolved over time. He cites the creation of civilization to the development of something he calls a psychotropic mechanism. And what that says is that it isn't just substances that you can ingest, right, that change your brain chemistry and influence your brain, like, psychotropic drugs, right? He says there are actual mechanisms that basically tap into the pharmacopoeia of your own body and your own hormones and manipulate you in certain ways. He talks about some of the earliest psychotropic mechanisms that were used to organize civilization
and control people
were symbols like gold, crowns, right? He talks about the fact that if you wanted to get people to do back-breaking agricultural work, right, you would basically need, because nobody really wanted to do this, you would basically need one slave driver to stand over every single worker with a whip and make them do it all day long. He said, but human beings figured out that you could create symbols, right, that would stand in place for the slave driver, right? And so there are all kinds of, laws against
your credit rating.
Your
my
credit
goodness!
Rating. Right, all kinds of
your
things.
Your whole
like
worth
that.
Is defined by your credit rating.
That's right.
But one of them is also clothing.
Yes.
Clothing becomes a way of establishing dominance hierarchies.
Yeah.
Who's allowed to wear what? Who's allowed to wear what colors?
Who can wear purple? Who can wear gold? Right.
And
who can wear a crown?
Who gets to wear the funny hats? Women aren't allowed to show their hair. You know what I mean?
Right.
These rules about clothing become ways of establishing dominance hierarchies, and also the fact that priests use clothing as a way of asserting their dominance and hierarchy.
And the staging of religious and political activity involves a lot of psychotropic mechanisms, and even think about what happens to your heart rate when you hear a siren, right, or you see a flashing light in your rearview mirror, right?
Or if you see a nun behind you in the airport, sometimes it feels good and sometimes not so good.
Yeah, but it changes your brain chemistry, right? You respond to these symbols, right? And basically what he said was that civilization is organized around these psychotropic mechanisms, these symbols, right, that get us basically to submit to civilization and its burdens. And Jesus says, throw these off. John the Baptist says, throw off these burdens.
Get rid of them.
You don't need to live this way.
And he says it in a way that relieves women of their household toil. which is a fascinating place to begin. Let me talk about the one woman who seemed to...
we are at
I
20
know,
minutes.
but we're going to go to 5 more minutes because it's such an important point.
Okay.
I didn't know you were going to go off on psychotropic mechanism for so long.
You did.
I did. Okay, but I'm going to end with an important point. Who listens to Jesus? Who takes this seriously? Let's not talking about reading this passage theologically. Let's talk about reading it literally. Who listened to Jesus? Mary Magdalene. What does Mary Magdalene do at the end of her life? She goes to the south of France to a cave where she is rumored to wear nothing but her hair. She goes to live like our Paleolithic ancestors in the place of the height of the interestingly named Magdalenian error. Read our book for the mysteries about that. Magdalenian error, and she wears nothing but her hair. She says, Jesus told me to live like a flower. I will live like a flower. And so the Magdalene does not invite us to become priestesses with robes and create new dominance hierarchies. She invites
throw off those hierarchies.
To throw them off completely, and to trust and love the bodies we've been given as the flowers we've been given by the earth, and for each of us to come into bloom without toil.
I think that's a wrap.
I think that's a wrap. So that's our first session. We're going to do this for 9 days in honor of St. Matthew, who has answered all of our attacks and money miracles beyond measure. You can read that passage on Facebook. We'll be here every day at 11. Thanks, everyone.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.